Naga Siren. Able to captivate and disable enemies with her song. Among the highsworn of the Slytherin Guard there is a solemn vow oft repeated before battle, no Slytherin may fail. In truth, these words are equal parts oath and enforceable covenant, for those who fall short of their duty are banished from the order. To fail is to be other than Slytherin. Once most highly esteemed of her race, Slithis for many years commanded a battalion of her fellows, using her formidable voice as her greatest weapon. Powerful, sinuous, serpentine, she led her deadly guard in defense of the deep ones, and the great wealth of the sunken cities. But in the final battle of Cray, her forces were driven back by a marauding army of Leviants intent on finding tribute for their god Maelron. After the long and bloody onslaught, as the bodies were cleared from the sunken halls, a single jeweled chalice was found missing from the trove. Of her 100 guard, only a handful survived, but their bravery and sacrifice were of little consequence. What mattered was that treasure was taken. Honor destroyed. And so Naga Siren was cast out. Banished to search for the stolen chalice. Though she might add 100 times her weight to the golden trove, she is doomed to live apart until that day she returns that which was taken. For no amount of gold is equal in honor to the honor she lost. Marcy. Dashes around pummeling enemies with rapid attacks. Admired by many, Marcy's origins are known to nameless few. She travels mostly in the company of the Princess Marana, but the roots of their friendship are entwined in secrets neither would ever needlessly reveal. To allies, she serves as fierce and honest companion. To enemies, she acts as dauntless deterrence against harming any she deems friend. Though unwise opponents may consider her size unremarkable, Marcy possesses an inner power that imbues her strikes with incredible might. She'll decimate those who think to test her, but those who earn her favor will have an unflappable confidant for life. Lich. Unleashes a powerful attack that bounces between enemies. In life, the frost mage Ithren, not yet a lich, had used the threat of destructive ice to enslave entire kingdoms. His subjects, aided by a few desperate magicians, eventually grew bold enough to ambush him. Armed with enough charmed rope to bind him forever, they tied the frost mage to adamant weights and dropped him in a pool known chiefly for being bottomless. It wasn't. He only fell for a year or so before an outcrop snagged him. There he rested, dead but undecaying, until the geomancer Anhil fought to verify the legend of the supposedly bottomless black pool. Anhil's plumbline snarled with the ropes that bound the drowned magician, and up he hauled an unexpected prize. Thinking that by rendering the dead undead, he could question the lich about the properties of the pool, he removed the bindings and commenced a simple rite of resurrection. Even the descendants of Ithren's enemies were long forgotten by time, so there were none to warn Anhil against imprudence. But he learned the error of his judgment almost immediately, as Lich threw off the shackles and consumed him. Legion Commander. Increases power with each duel victory. They came without warning. Within the city walls of Stonehall there came a rumble and a terrible sound, and from blackness unknown came a force of beasts numbering beyond count, wielding flame and foul sorcery, slaying and snatching mothers and sons to dark purpose. Of once mighty Stonehall's military strength only the Bronze Legion, led by the indomitable commander Trayston, was near enough to answer the call of battle. They rode into their city, fighting through blood-stained alleyways and burning markets, cutting their way through the monstrous throng to the source of the sudden invasion, an ethereal rift within the city square, and at its precipice thundered their dreaded champion. Enwrapped in a corrosive shimmer, the leader of the abyssal horde swung its massive blade, cleaving a legionnaire in two as his flesh began to spoil. Trayston lifted her blood-stained sword and settled her sights on the beast. It turned, smiling at her through a maze of teeth. Heedless of the battle raging around them, they charged one another. Deflecting blow after blow, the pair danced their deadly duel as the Bronze Legion met its end around them. Trayston leapt forward as her foe swung its sword to meet her. The odds turned. The attack smashed into Tristan suddenly, a brutal thrust from the side, but even as her balance slipped she rallied her strength for another stroke. Blade scraped on blade, beyond the hilt to the gnarled paw below, carving it in two in a fearsome spray of sparks and blood. The vile audience looked on in astonishment as she pressed the attack, driving her blade through her foe's flesh into the stampeding heart within. With a scream that split the clouds above, the beast erupted in a torrent of gore and anguish. The Stygian portal wavered, the power sustaining the chasm beyond vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The remaining invaders fell quickly to Stonehall steel. Though victorious, the survivors saw little to celebrate. The city lay in ruins, and survivors were few. Fires continued to spread. Unfurling her banners of war, Tristan gathered what allies she could. Her anger smoldered as she pledged brutal vengeance upon the forces of the abyss, and damned be any who would dare stand in her way. Invoker weaves magic with an array of spell combos. In its earliest, and some would say most potent form, magic was primarily the art of memory. It required no technology, no wands or appurtenances other than the mind of the magician. All the trappings of ritual were merely mnemonic devices, meant to allow the practitioner to recall in rich detail the specific mental formulae that unlocked a spell's power. The greatest mages in those days were the ones blessed with the greatest memories, and yet so complex were the invocations that all wizards were forced to specialize. The most devoted might hope in a lifetime to have adequate recollection of 3 spells for at most. Ordinary wizards were content to know 2, and it was not uncommon for a village mage to know only one, with even that requiring him to consult grimoires as an aid against forgetfulness on the rare occasions when he might be called to use it. But among these early practitioners there was one exception, a genius of vast intellect and prodigious memory who came to be known as the Invoker. In his youth, the precocious wizard mastered not 4, not 5, not even 7 incantations. He could command no fewer than 10 spells, and cast them instantly. Many more he learned but found useless, and would practice once then purge from his mind forever, to make room for more practical invocations. One such spell was the sempiternal cantripate longevity spell, of such power that those who cast it in the world's first days are among us still, unless they have been crushed to atoms. Most of these quasi-immortals live quietly, afraid to admit their secret, but Invoker is not one to keep his gifts hidden. He is ancient, learned beyond all others, and his mind somehow still has space to contain an immense sense of his own worth, as well as the invocations with which he amuses himself through the long slow twilight of the world's dying days. Gyrocopter barrages with his cannon and homing missiles. After serving through a lifetime of wars, upheaval, riots, and revolutions, the brass-figured Aurel had seen enough. But in addition to a few trinkets and his considerable pension, the erstwhile engineer left with something far more interesting, a long-forgotten, incomplete schematic for a gyrocopter, the world's first manned, non-magical flying device. Retiring to the tropical obscurity of the Ash archipelago with little else but time and money, he set to work building the device. As the years wore on and the remains of failed prototypes began to pile up, he began to wonder if mechanical flight was even possible. A decade and a day after his retirement, on a sunny afternoon with a southerly breeze, Aurel sat in his latest attempt, bristling with indignation and expectant failure. With a grunt of effort he pulled the ignition cord and covered his head, waiting for the inevitable explosion. However, to his great surprise he began to lift and, following a few panicked adjustments, stabilize. Within an hour, he was ducking and weaving with the breeze, level with the gulls, and Aurel found himself filled with the breathless wonder of flight. As dusk settled in, he set a course back to his workshop, but no sooner had he turned his craft when a cannonball tore through his tailfin. Disentangling himself from the wreckage, he swam toward the nearest piece of land in sight, and cursed to see the ship responsible for the cannonball collecting the debris. Days later, when Aurel returned to his workshop, he set to work on yet another gyrocopter, this one capable of carrying a much heavier, more dangerous payload. IAO. links to its allies to buff them. Io is everywhere, and in all things. Denounced by enemies as the great unmaker, worshipped by scholars as the twinkling of a divine eye, this strange wisp of life force occupies all planes at once, the merest fraction of its being crossing into physical existence at any one moment. Like the great twin riders dark and light, and yet another ancient traveler whose true history is lost to the ages, Io the Wisp is a fundamental of the universe, a force older than time, a wanderer from realms far beyond mortal understanding. Io is nothing less than the sum of all attractive and repulsive forces within the material field, a sentient manifestation of the charge that bind existence together. It is only in the controlled warping of these electrical waylines that Io's presence can be experienced on the physical plane. A benevolent, cooperative force, Io bonds its strange magnetism to others so that the power of allies might be enhanced. Its motives inscrutable, its strength unimaginable, Io moves through the physical plane, the perfect expression of the mysteries of the universe. Jakiro freezes and burns enemies with magic. Even among magical beasts, a twin-headed dragon is a freak. Equal parts ice and fire, cunning and rage, the creature known as Jakiro glides over charred and ice-bound battlefields, laying waste to any who would bear arms against it. Pyrexy dragon clutches always contain 2 fledglings. Famous for their viciousness even from the first moments of life, newly hatched dragons of this species will try to kill their sibling while still in the nest. Only the strongest survive. In this way is the strength of the Pyrexy line ensured. By some accident of nature, the freak Jakiro hatched from a single egg, combining in a single individual the full range of abilities found within the diverse Pyrexy species. Trapped within the armature of its monstrous body, the powers of ice and fire combine, and now no enemy is safe. Grimstroke disables enemies with a swipe of his brush. The people of Ashkavor crowded around the temple square, eager to witness the ascension of their new guardian to stand near the man as he bound their souls to his own. But as his final brush strokes fell against the runestone, and the bond of a new ascended one was forged, everyone, even those who'd stayed in their homes, could sense that something had gone terribly wrong. He knew the cause instantly. The droplets of ichor he'd procured to amplify the potency of his inkpots had instead contaminated them, and the power of the binding spell he'd cast now threatened to consume him. An inky corruption snaked upward from the runestone, along the handle of his brush, soon overtaking his hands. From there it spread quickly. Once it overcame his face and his mouth, he couldn't have screamed even if he'd wanted to. All of his life he'd calculated on how to attain ever greater powers than the limits presented by his teachers would allow, going so far as to break the sacred prohibition against augmenting the inks. Indeed, with the wellspring of the ascended bond open to him, he felt a measure of power coursing into his soul like he'd never imagined. His greatest triumph was upon him, if he could only survive it. He drew deep from the power of the bond, pushing back against the corrupted ink flow. A great moan filled the air, the collective cry of his people. Some swayed on their feet. The weakest collapsed. Many tried to run. And still deeper he pulled from their bloodline reservoir. But it wasn't enough to stop the ink tide. It was only when the breath trapped in his lungs began to fail him, and the ink pool darkness fully encased him, that he saw his way out. The bond he'd made with the Ashkavran people, his people meant to be drawn upon only in service of their protection. It flowed 2 ways. With a final surge of strength, this time directed by more than just blind repulsion, he pushed the ink torrent into the bond itself. Slowly, he felt the tide retreat, and heard the awful wails of his people as the corruption in turn rolled over them. When at last the ink relented, his eyes opened upon a world changed. The Ashkavran people as he knew them were gone. Every last soul was transformed into terrifying shades of their former selves, comprised no longer of blood and bone, only viscid, tainted ink. Faceless Void can freeze his enemies in time. Dark Terror, the Faceless Void, is a visitor from Clasharim, a realm outside of time. It remains a mystery why this being from another dimension believes the struggle for the Nemesis stones is worth entering our physical plane, but apparently an upset in the balance of power in this world has repercussions in adjacent dimensions. Time means nothing to Dark Terror, except as a way to thwart his foes and aid his allies. His long view of the cosmos has given him a remote, disconnected quality, although in battle he is quite capable of making it personal. Mirana stuns enemies with precise arrows from afar. Born to a royal family, a blood princess next in line for the solar throne, Mirana willingly surrendered any claim to mundane land or titles when she dedicated herself completely to the service of Selamine, goddess of the moon. Known ever since as Princess of the Moon, Mirana prowls the sacred night silver woods searching for any who would dare poach the sacred luminous lotus from the silvery pools of the goddess's preserve. Riding on her enormous feline familiar, she is poised, proud and fearless, attuned to the phases of the moon and the wheeling of the greater constellations. Her bow, tipped with sharp shards of lunar ore, draws on the moon's power to charge its arrows of light. Oracle alters the fates of heroes with his buffs and nukes. Ascendants to the great seat of Samuri had for ages imported their oracles exclusively from the ivory incubarium, high in the hollow peaks of the Zealots' range, with a down payment made at the time of the embryo's conception and the balance surrendered on delivery of a mature, well-trained prophet to the gate of the graven king. Raised by same pallid sibyls who bred and birthed them, all sanctioned oracles were anchored by their physical form to the world we most of us share. Meanwhile, their souls roamed far afield, barely bound by the airiest astral umbilicus. From such cosmic roamings the prophets would return, speaking words of fire with tongues of flesh. Their mystic utterances were analyzed by the Samuri advisors, who found in them visions of the future, diplomatic advice, all the supernatural ammunition the line of graven kings needed to secure victory in every campaign, whether in the court or on the battlefield. Thus it went for generations, the Graventome's pages filling with the names of triumphant kings and the new domains they had acquired. So it went, that is, until the particular oracle named Nerif arrived to serve the very last of the stone-helmed kings. From the first, Nerif's prophecies were unusual. They seemed not merely to portend the future, but to shape it. The weird soothsayer croaked out advice no one had requested, and suddenly the Samuri found themselves immersed in conflicts with newfound enemies. The advisors, sensing a threat to their power, were quick to pin these unwelcome developments on the latest oracle. They demanded his removal, petitioning the sibyls to reclaim their defective prophet and replace him with a worthy substitute. But Nerif described an ominous dream of the incubarium's destruction, and within hours came news of the ancient school's destruction in a catastrophic avalanche. Fearing the same fate as the pallid sibyls, the advisors withdrew to their council chambers, suddenly anxious to avoid the oracle's notice. The graven king, however, was a creature of great practicality. He doubted the commitment of his overprudent advisors. An oracle of such rarity, he reasoned, ought be used as a weapon to enlarge his domain. He therefore demoted his timid counselors and stationed Nerif at his side. With only a blunt understanding of Nerif's talent, he boldly stated the outcomes he desired, and coaxed Nerif into uttering his wishes as prophecy. At first, all was well. The last graven king boasted that by adopting fate's pet, he had made a plaything of fate itself. He should have taken it as a warning then when, on the eve of his invasion of the unsated satrap's realm, he attempted to coerce a prediction of certain victory from his oracle, only to hear Nerif quietly mutter, "It could go either way." No firmer statement could he force from Nerif's lips. Still, the king was confident in his army. The satrapy was landlocked, poorly armed, and shut off from all possible allies. He took "it could go either way" to indicate that with tactical might on his side, there was little risk in his plan. Of course, we now know that he should have taken the sayer's words more literally. Even with careful study of the annotated annals of If, what happened on the field before the unsated satrap's palace is almost impossible to visualize. It appears that in the midst of the carnage, the battle began to bifurcate. At each pivotal moment, reality calved and broke into bits. Soldiers who staggered and fell in battle also stood sure-footed, forging onward to fight. Their minds also split. The warriors found themselves both dead and alive, existent and non-existent. Victory and defeat were partitioned, so that each separate outcome was experienced in simultaneity by both armies. The universe became a hall of mirrors, with all the mirrors endlessly shattering. The immediate effect on both parties was insanity. Unable to comprehend the state of being both triumphant and defeated, the graven king's mind dispersed into motes of M. Wraith King can reincarnate instantly upon death. For untold years, King Asterion built a kingdom from the remains of his enemies. It was an obsessive's errand, done to pass the long eternities of a monarchy that seemed fated never to end. He believed that as long as he built up the towers of his palace, he could not die. But eventually he learned that he had been deluded, that bone itself could perish. Deeply mistrustful of flesh, he sought a more permanent way of extending his reign, and at last settled on pursuit of wraith energy, a form of pure spirit given off by certain dark souls at death. Should he infuse himself with wraith essence, he thought he might create a body as luminous and eternal as his ego. On the millennial solstice known as Wraith Night, he submitted to a rite of transformation, compelling his subjects to harvest enough souls to fuel his ambition for immortality. No one knows how many of his champions died, for the only survivor who mattered was the Wraith King who rose with the sun on the following morn. Now he rarely spends a moment on his glowing throne but strides out with sword drawn, demanding a fealty that extends far beyond death. Tusk snowballs into his enemies to stun. It had been a brawl to remember. There stood Emer, the Tusk, the terror from the barrier, the snowball from Cobalt, the only fighter to have bested the bristled bruiser in a fair fight, and now the last man standing in Wolfston Tavern. What started as a simple bar bed of supremacy ended with 4 regulars, a blacksmith, and 6 of the Frost Brigade's best soldiers writhing against the shards and splinters of almost every bottle, mug, and chair in the building. The Tusk boasted and toasted his victory as he emptied his brew. No sooner had the defeated regained consciousness than the cries for double or nothing rang out. The Tusk was pleased at the prospect, but none could think of a bet bigger than the one he just conquered. Horrified at the damage to his tavern and desperate to avoid another brawl, the barkeep had an idea. As skilled as he was, Emer had never taken part in a real battle, never tested himself against the indiscriminate death and chaos of war. He proposed a wager to the fighter, seek out the biggest battle he could find, survive, and win it for whichever side he chose. The stakes? The next round of drinks. Weaver rewinds time to reverse damage and position. The fabric of creation needs constant care, lest it grow tattered, for when it unravels, whole worlds come undone. It is the work of the weavers to keep the fabric tight, to repair worn spots in the mesh of reality. They also defend from the things that gnaw and lay their eggs in frayed regions, whose young can quickly devour an entire universe if the weavers let their attention lapse. Skitsker was a master weaver, charged with keeping one small patch of creation tightly woven and unfaded. But the job was not enough to satisfy. It nagged him that the original work of creation all lay in the past. The loom had done its work and traveled on. He wanted to create rather than merely maintain to weave worlds of his own devising. He began making small changes to his domain, but the thrill of creation proved addictive, and his strokes became bolder, pulling against the pattern that the loom had woven. The Guardians came, with their scissors, and Weaver's world was pared off, snipped from the cosmic tapestry, which they rewove without him in it. Skitsker found himself alone, apart from his kind, a state that would have been torment for any other weaver. But Skitsker rejoiced, for now he was free. Free to create for himself, to begin anew. The raw materials he needed to weave a new reality were all around him. All he had to do was tear apart this old world at the seams. Void Spirit steps in and out of the mortal plane to strike his foes. Not even the other spirits claim to understand the mind and machinations of the eldest amongst them, Enai the Void Spirit. Privy to secrets that would shatter a mortal mind, the Void Spirit observes the workings of the universe from an unknowable vantage, choosing to let carefully groomed servants do his bidding, only emerging from his hidden temple into the material plane when he deems that he alone can steer the course of reality along its proper path. With an expansive perspective on existence, Enai is focused intently on a point in time beyond which he cannot see, when the fabrics of multiple realities are fated to collide. Now he steps from the ether to personally resolve the battle of the ancients and prepare his allies for what he views as a greater conflict to come. Pugna drains enemy life to heal himself. In the realm of Pugna's birth, near the vents of the nether reaches, there stood a lamasery devoted to the arts of oblivion, which drew its power from the nether energies. The Grand Master of the temple compound had himself passed into oblivion several years prior, leaving his academy without a leader. From the moment of their master's death, the regents of the temple began rites of divination to identify their master's reincarnation, and eventually all signs converged on the immediate neighborhood. Several villages squatted in the shadow of the temple, their alleys and plazas full of the laughter of squalling children. Pugna, a mere 13 months of age, was but one candidate among the local brats, and on the appointed day he was presented at the temple alongside 2 other promising tots. The lamas offered a jumble of worn relics to the children, treasured possessions of their former grandmaster. One boy reached for a porphyry wand that had belonged to the lama, and put it in his nostril. An impish girl pulled out an amulet that had also been the lama's, and immediately swallowed it. Pugna regarded the other 2 coolly, gave a merry laugh, and blasted them with gouts of emerald flame, reducing them to ashes in an instant. He then snatched up the wand and amulet, saying, "Mine." The regents hoisted the beaming Pugna on their shoulders, wrapped him in their grandmaster's vestments, and rushed him to the throne before his mood could change. Within 5 years, the temple itself was another pile of ash, which pleased Pugna to no end. Razor steals enemy damage to add to his own. Among the emblematic powers that populate the Underscape, Razor the Lightning Revenant is one of the most feared. With his whip of lightning, he patrols the narrow maze, that treacherous webwork of passages by which the souls of the dead are sorted according to their own innate intelligence, cunning, and persistence. Drifting above the maze, Razor looks down on the baffled souls below, and delivers jolts of scalding electricity that both punish and quicken the souls as they decide their own fates, hurrying on toward luminous exits or endlessly dark pits. Razor is the eternal embodiment of a dominating power, abstract and almost clinical in his application of power. Yet he has a lordly air that suggests he takes a sardonic satisfaction in his work. Puck orbs to enemies and silences them. While Puck seems at first glance a mischievous, childish character, this quality masks an alien personality. The juvenile form of a fairy dragon, a creature that lives for eons, Puck spends countless millennia in its childish form. So while it is technically true that Puck is juvenile, it will continue to be so when the cities of the present age have sloughed away into dust. Its motives are therefore inscrutable, and what appears to be play may in fact hide a darker purpose. Its endless fondness for mischief is the true indicator of Puck's true nature. Anti-Mage slashes his foes with mana-draining attacks. The monks of Turstarkuri watched the rugged valleys below their mountain monastery as wave after wave of invaders swept through the lower kingdoms. Ascetic and pragmatic, in their remote monastic area they remained aloof from mundane strife, wrapped in meditation that knew no gods or elements of magic. Then came the Legion of the Dead God, crusaders with a sinister mandate to replace all local worship with their unliving lord's poisonous nihilosophy. From a landscape that had known nothing but blood and battle for 1,000 years, they tore the souls and bones of countless fallen legions and pitched them against Turstarkuri. The monastery stood scarcely a fortnight against the assault, and the few monks who bothered to surface from their meditations believed the invaders were but demonic visions sent to distract them from meditation. They died where they sat on their silken cushions. Only one youth survived, a pilgrim who had come as an acolyte, seeking wisdom, but had yet to be admitted to the monastery. He watched in horror as the monks to whom he had served tea and nettles were first slaughtered, then raised to join the ranks of the dead god's priesthood. With nothing but a few of Turstarkuri's prized dogmatic scrolls, he crept away to the comparative safety of other lands, swearing to obliterate not only the dead god's magic users but to put an end to magic altogether. AXE taunts and forces enemies to attack him. As a grunt in the army of Red Mist, Mogul Khan set his sights on the rank of Red Mist General. In battle after battle he proved his worth through gory deed. His rise through the ranks was helped by the fact that he never hesitated to decapitate a superior. Through the 7-year campaign of the Thousand Tarns, he distinguished himself in glorious carnage, his star of fame shining ever brighter, while the number of comrades in arms steadily dwindled. On the night of ultimate victory, Axe declared himself the new Red Mist General and took on the ultimate title of Axe. But his troops now numbered 0. Of course, many had died in battle, but a significant number had also fallen to Axe's blade. Needless to say, most soldiers now shun his leadership. But this matters not a whit to Axe, who knows that a one-man army is by far the best. Abaddon shields his allies or himself from attacks. The font of Avernus is the source of a family's strength, a crack in primal stones from which vapors of prophetic power have issued for generations. Each newborn of the cavernous house Avernus is bathed in the black mist, and by this baptism they are given an innate connection to the mystic energies of the land. They grow up believing themselves fierce protectors of their lineal traditions, the customs of the realm, but what they really are protecting is the font itself. And the motives of the mist are unclear. When the infant Abaddon was bathed in the font, they say something went awry. In the child's eyes there flared a light of comprehension that startled all present and set the sacerdotes to whispering. He was raised with every expectation of following the path all scions of Avernus took to train in war, that in times of need he might lead the family's army in defense of the ancestral lands. But Abaddon was always one apart. Where others trained with weapons, he bent himself to meditation in the presence of the mist. He drank deep from the vapors that welled from the font, learning to blend his spirit with the potency that flowed from far beneath the house. He became a creature of the black mist. There was bitterness within the House of Avernus elders and young alike accusing him of neglecting his responsibilities. But all such accusations stopped when Abaddon rode into battle, and they saw how the powers of the mist had given him mastery over life and death beyond those of any lord the house had ever known. Winter Wyvern able to force her enemies to attack their own ally. Like many great poets, Oroth just wants time to write, but the Winter Wyvern's life is full of interruptions. The epics of the Eldworms have a long and colorful history, but some fear that the remaining dragon scholars are not as prolific as they once were, with few lines added to the Eldworm Eddas since the last age of greatness. Oroth laments, "We forget that there is more to life than triumph and dominion over enemies. We must also live our lives in the pursuit of creative expression." She embarks on research expeditions, collecting books for inspiration. But all this research can be terribly distracting, and she spends less time writing than she should. Although she knows she should be lurking in her lair, adding to the Eddas, she finds herself engaged in epic battles against powerful enemies. She loots castles, raids ancient libraries, and if she happens to heap glory on herself in the process, she tells herself that it's merely a side effect of her research. The fact is, while her skill and power on the battlefield are legendary, her scholarly travails have thus far hardly been the stuff of literary acclaim. But she is not content to stand as a protagonist of heroic lore. She wishes also to create it. Zeus strikes enemies near and far with lightning. Lord of heaven, father of gods, Zeus treats all the heroes as if they are his rambunctious, rebellious children. After being caught unnumbered times in the midst of trysts with countless mortal women, his divine wife finally gave him an ultimatum: if you love mortals so much, go and become one. If you can prove yourself faithful, then return to me as my immortal husband. Otherwise, go and die among your creatures. Zeus found her logic, and her magic, irrefutable, and agreed to her plan. He has been on his best behavior ever since, being somewhat fonder of immortality than he is of mortals. But to prove himself worthy of his eternal spouse, he must continue to pursue victory on the field of battle. Nyx Assassin reflects enemy damage and stuns. Deep in the archive of Ultimer, shelved between scholarly treatises on dragon cladistics and books of untranslatable spells, there is an ancient tome of entomological curiosities. Compiled by scholars, the book describes the telepathic talents of the zealot scarab, a strange species of social insect with abilities unique to all the 7 planes. Unlike most grubs of his colony, Nyx Assassin did not arise from metamorphosis with the plodding thoughts and blunted appendages common to the worker caste of his kind. For his was a special transformation, guided by the grace of Nyx. He was the chosen one, selected from the many and anointed with an extract of the queen goddess herself. Not all survived the dark blessing of the queen's chamber, but he emerged with a penetrating mind, and dagger-like claws, his razor-sharp mandibles raking the air while his thoughts projected directly into the minds of those around him. Of all zealot scarabs, he alone was selected for the highest calling. After his metamorphosis, he was reborn, by grace of Nyx, with abilities which shaped him for one thing and one thing only: to kill in the name of his goddess. Phantom Lancer creates illusions of himself to trick or attack foes. The remote village of Pol had no knowledge of the wars raging in the heart of the kingdom. For them, the quiet of spearfishing and a family meal were all that a full life required. Yet war came for them nonetheless. Joining the able-bodied conscripts as they filed past their homes, the humble lancer Azraith vowed to bring peace to his kingdom, and in so doing, his people. Placed with his kin in the vanguard of the final assault against the dread Magus Vorn, the cost to his fellows was absolute. As the charging force battled toward the fortress, Azraith alone among his kind remained standing, and he alone was able to infiltrate the keep. Focused and infuriated by the slaughter of his brothers, Azraith bested each of the wizard's deadly traps and conjured guardians. Soon the simple fisherman arrived at Vorn's tower sanctum. The pair dueled through the night, pike to staff, as chaos raged below, and with a deafening cry Azraith pierced his enemy. But the wizard did not simply expire, he exploded into uncountable shards of light, penetrating his killer with power. As the dust settled and the smoke of combat began to clear, Azraith found himself standing among a throng of his kin. Each seemed to be dressed as he was, each seemed armed as he was, and he could sense that each thought as he did. Aware that his allies were approaching, he willed these phantoms to hide themselves, and one by one they began to vanish into nothingness. As the soldiers came upon the sanctum, they found the warrior that had bested the wizard. When they approached their champion, the lancer vanished. The pikeman who had stood before them was no more than another phantom. Centaur Warrener reflects damage back to his attackers. It's said that a centaur's road is paved with the corpses of the fallen. For the one called War Runner, it has been a long road indeed. To outsiders, the four-legged clans of Druid are often mistaken for simple, brutish creatures. Their language has no written form, their culture lacks pictographic traditions, structured music, formalized religion. For centaurs, combat is the perfect articulation of thought, the highest expression of self. If killing is an art among centaurs, then Brad Warden the War Runner is their greatest artist. He rose to dominance on the proving grounds of Omex, an ancient arena where centaur clans have for millennia gathered to perform their gladiatorial rites. As his fame spread, spectators came from far and wide to see the great centaur in action. Always the first to step into the arena, and the last to leave, he composes a masterpiece in each guttering spray, each thrust of blood-slickened blade length. It is the poetry of blood on steel, flung in complex patterns across the pale sands of the killing floor. Warrunner defeated warrior after warrior, until the arena boomed with the cheering of his name, and he found himself alone, the uncontested champion of his kind. The great belt of Omex was bestowed, wrapped around his broad torso, but in his victory, the death artist found only emptiness. For what is a warrior without a challenge? The great centaur galloped out of Omex that day with a new goal. To his people, Warrunner is the greatest warrior to ever step into the arena. Now he has set out to prove he is the greatest fighter who has ever lived. Bristleback takes reduced damage when facing away from enemies. Never one to turn his back on a fight, Rigwarl was known for battling the biggest, meanest scrappers he could get his hands on. Christened Bristleback by the drunken crowds, he waded into backroom brawls in every road tavern between Slom and Els, until his exploits finally caught the eye of a barkeep in need of an enforcer. For a bit of brew, Bristleback was hired to collect tabs, keep the peace, and break the occasional leg or two, or five, in the case of one unfortunate webhund. After indulging in a night of merriment during which bodily harm was meted out in equal parts upon both delinquent patrons and his own liver, Bristleback finally met his match. "Your tusks offend me, sir," he was heard to drunkenly slur to one particularly large fellow from the northern wastes whose bill had come due. What followed was a fight for the ages. A dozen fighters jumped in. No stool was left unbroken, and in the end, the impossible happened. The tab went unpaid. Over the weeks that followed, Bristleback's wounds healed, and his quills grew back, but an enforcer's honor can be a prickly thing. He paid the tab from his own coin, vowing to track down this northerner and extract redemption. And then he did something he'd never done before. He actually trained, and in so doing made a startling discovery about himself. A smile peeled back from his teeth as he flexed his quills. Turning his back to a fight might be just the thing. Bounty Hunter loots and collects bounties off of his enemies. When the hunted tell tales of Gondar the bounty hunter, none are sure of which are true. In whispered tones they say he was abandoned as a kit, learning his skill in tracking as a matter of simple survival. Others hear he was an orphan of war, taken in by the great Sarek the hunter to learn the master's skill with a blade as they plumbed the dark forests for big game. Still others believe he was a lowly street urchin raised among a guild of cutpurses and thieves, trained in the arts of stealth and misdirection. Around campfires in the wild countryside his quarry speaks the rumors of Gondar's work, growing ever more fearful. They say it was he who tracked down the tyrant King Goth years after the mad regent went into hiding, delivering his head and scepter as proof. That it was he who infiltrated the rebel camps at High Seat, finally bringing the legendary thief White Cape to be judged for his crimes. And that it was he who ended the career of Sarek the hunter, condemned as a criminal for killing the prince's prized Hellkite. The tales of Gondar's incredible skill stretch on, with each daring feat more unbelievable than the last, each target more elusive. For the right price, the hunted know anyone can be found. For the right price, even the mightiest may find fear in the shadows. Leakin shapeshifts into a ferocious beast. Banehallow was noble-born to the House of Ambry, the greatest of the landed castes in the old kingdom of Slom. Before the fall, as the king's wants grew strange, and his court grew crowded with sorcerers and charlatans, the House of Ambry was the first to rise against the avarice of the throne. No longer willing to pay homage and fealty, they instead sent 6,000 swords into the capital, where they were wiped out in the massacre of the apostates. And then came the teeth behind the old truth. When you strike a king's neck, you had better take his head. Enraged by the betrayal, the king exterminated the vast Ambry bloodline, sparing only the lord of the house and his youngest son, Banehallow. Before all the royal court, with the disgraced lord chained to the ornate marble floor, the king bade his magicians transform the boy into a wolf so that he might tear out his own father's throat. "Do this," the king said, "so that Lord Ambry will understand the bite of betrayal." Powerful magic was invoked, and the child was transformed. But though his body was changed, his spirit remained intact, and instead of biting the exposed neck of his father, he attacked his handlers, tearing them to pieces. A dozen of the king's knights perished under the wolf's teeth before they managed to drive it off into the night. Lord Ambry laughed from his chains even as the king ran him through with a sword. Now the heir to the lost house of Ambry, Banehallow wanders the trail as the Leakin, part warrior, part wolf, in search of justice for all that he lost. Leshrac can deal heavy damage in an aura around himself. Leshrac, tormented soul, is an entity torn from the heart of nature, a liminal being that exists half in one plane of existence, half in another. His penetrating intelligence is such that he can never ignore for a moment the agonizing horror at the heart of all creation. Once a great philosopher who sought the meaning of existence, he plumbed the depths of nature with the haunted chronoptic crystals, and was forever altered by the hideous mysteries thereby revealed to him. Now the darkest depths of his enlightenment are illumined only by the fitful glare of his arrogance. Like other elemental characters, he is completely at one with nature, but in his case it is a nature lurid and vile. He alone sees the evil truth of reality, and has no use for those who believe the cosmos reserves a special reward for those who practice benevolence. Luna tears into her enemies with bouncing attacks. How had she been reduced to this? She was once the scourge of the plains, a merciless leader of men and beasts, and able to sow terror wherever she dared. Now she was far from her homeland, driven half-mad from starvation and months of wandering, her army long dead or worse. As she stood at the edge of an ancient forest, a pair of glowing eyes spied on from an elder branch. Something beautiful and deadly sought a meal in the wilting dusk. Without a sound, it turned and left. Fury overtook her. Clutching a rust-eaten dagger, she charged after the beast determined to reclaim even a shred of her past glory, but her quarry would not be caught. 3 times she cornered the creature among the rocks and trees, and 3 times she pounced only to witness its fading shadow darting further into the woods. Yet the full moon shone brightly, and the creature's trail was easy to follow. Arriving in a clearing atop a high hill, the beast's massive feline form sat in the open, attentive and waiting. When the woman brandished her dagger, the creature reared and roared and charged. Death, it seemed, had come for her at long last in this strange place. She stood, calm and ready. A flash of movement, and the beast snatched the dagger from her hand before vanishing into the forest. Stillness. Hooded figures approached. In reverent tones they revealed that Selamine, goddess of the moon, had chosen her, had guided her, had tested her. Unwittingly she had endured the sacred rites of the dark moon, warriors of the night silver woods. She was offered a choice, join the dark moon and pledge herself to the service of Selamine, or leave and never return. She did not hesitate. Embracing her absolution, she renounced her bloody past, and took up a new mantle as Luna of the Dark Moon, the dreaded Moonrider, ruthless and ever-loyal guardian of the Night Silver Woods. Lone Druid commands a powerful spirit bear in battle. Long before the first words of the first histories there rose the Druidic Bear Clan. Wise and just they were, and focused in their ways to seek an understanding of the natural order. The arch forces of nature saw this, and so sought the most learned among them. Wise old Scylla, clan justiciar and seer, stepped forward for his kin, and to him was given the seed with these words, when all of the world has dimmed, when civilization has left these lands, when the world is slain and racked by the endless deserts at the end of ages, plant the seed. As he grasped his trust, Scylla felt his years recede and his vitality returned. Vast knowledge burst into his mind. He found himself able to project his very will into reality and, with some concentration, alter his own physical form as well. Yet subtle whispers and cruel ears brought word of the seed and its power to other peoples, and a terrible war crashed upon the Bear clan. As his ancestral home burned, Scylla took his burden and fled to the wild places. Ages passed, and time and myth forgot the Bear clan, forgot Scylla and the seed, forgot wondrous civilizations that rose and fell in Bear clan's wake. For millennia Scylla has waited for word from his deities, waited for peace to come to the ever-warring realms, waited in exile and in secret for the end of all things and for the conclusion of his sacred commitment, preparing himself always to face and destroy whatever would dare threaten his purpose. Pangolier dashes and rolls in to disrupt enemy movements. The men and women that make up the Niven gallants live a life of swordplay, chandelier swinging, and tawdry romance. And while all adhere to their creed that a life of adventure is the only life worth living, the exploits of Dante Panlin still managed to raise the eyebrows of even the most hedonistic of swordsmen. There is no monster he won't slay. No creature he won't woo. No tyrant he won't stand against. And no noble immune to his silver tongue. Outworld Destroyer can imprison a hero, making them invulnerable. One of a lordly and magisterial race, Harbinger prowls the edge of the void, sole surviving sentry of an outpost on the world at the rim of the abyss. From this jagged crystalline outworld, forever on guard, he has gazed for eternities into the heavens, alert for any stirring in the bottomless night beyond the stars. Imprinted deep in the shining lattices of his intellect lies a resonant pattern akin to prophecy, a dark music implying that eventually some evil will wake out there, beyond the edges of creation, and turn its attention to our world. With his whole being focused on his vigil, Outworld Destroyer paid little attention to events closer into the sun. But at last the clamor of the ancients, and a sense of growing threat from within as well as without, sent him winging sunward to visit the plains of war. Harbinger's place in our own prophecies is unambiguous. He must be considered an omen of worse things to come. But his arrival in itself is bad enough. Underlord teleports his team in and out of battle. Neither myth nor song exist to tell of their coming. Deep below the surface of the world lay unknown wonders and horrors. Down and down again, while beneath the slithering magma fields and simmering roots of dormant volcanoes stands the obsidian city of Aziog, its incomparable stonework spanning an endless cavern. Within honeycomb walls mortared with the bones of countless slaves lies the domain of the abyssal horde, and their brutal underlord Vrogros. Armed by the monstrous forge masters of his kind and well-practiced in the arts of the Dark Rift, Vrogros is able to conjure forth flame and crippling malice through the twist between worlds. He seeks always to expand his holdings, destroying or enslaving all he encounters. Yet the lands offered by the subterranean realm are few, and so his sights have turned upward. By his command the first waves of abyssal invaders have already marched through the rift, a few doomed legions meant merely to test the might of nations above. Now, as his full force readies itself for unending conquest, Vrogros himself steps into a sunlit world to announce his coming reign. Those who face the Underlord will bow and pay tribute, or be crushed where they stand. Tidehunter durable hero who shrugs off enemy damage. The Tidehunter known as Leviathan was once the champion of the Sunken Isles, but his motives are as mysterious as those of his people. We all know the importance of the Drylander's shipping lanes, how empires may rise and fall according to who controls the open water. Far less is known of the submarine lanes, and how the warring tribes of the Maranthic diaspora have carved out habitations through endless undersea skirmishes. In the fragile treaties between the Mare and Men, we can glimpse the extent of the drowned empires, but their politics appear complex and opaque. It would seem that Leviathan tired of such petty strife, and set off on his own, loyal only to his abyssal god, Maelron the Tentacular. He stalks the shallows now in search of men or Marants who stray into his path, and with a particular loathing for Admiral Kunkka, who has long been his nemesis for reasons lost in the deepest trenches of the sea. Templar Assassin. Slows down enemies with traps. Linnea, the Templar assassin, came to her calling by a path of curious inquiry. Possessed of a scientific bent, she spent her early years engaged in meticulous study of nature's laws, peering into grimoires of magic and alchemy, recreating experiments from charred fragments of the Violet Archives, and memorizing observations of the keen record keepers. Already quiet and secretive by nature, the difficulty of acquiring these objects further reinforced her skills of stealth. Had she been less retiring, she might have become notorious among the guilds as a thief scholar. Instead, her investigations led her into far more obscure corners. As she devoted her furtive talents to unlocking the secrets of the universe, she instead unlocked a secret door that exists in nature itself, the entryway to the most hidden temple. The intelligences that waited beyond that portal proved to be expecting her, and whatever mysteries they revealed in the moment of their discovery was nothing compared to the answers they held out to Linnea should she continue in their service. She swore to protect the mysteries, but more to the point, in service to the hidden temple she satisfies her endless craving for understanding. In the eyes of each foe she expunges, a bit more of the mystery is revealed. Tiny. Grows in size and strength as battle ensues. Coming to life as a chunk of stone, Tiny's origins are a mystery on which he continually speculates. He is a stone giant now, but what did he used to be? A splinter broken from a golem's heel? A shard swept from a gargoyle sculptor's workshop? A fragment of the oracular visage of Garthos? A deep curiosity drives him, and he travels the world tirelessly seeking his origins, his parentage, his people. As he roams, he gathers weight and size, the forces that weather lesser rocks, instead cause Tiny to grow and ever grow. Troll Warlord. Swaps between ranged and melee attacks at will. It's an easy thing to offend a troll. A prickly and contentious race, trolls thrive on argument and strife, missing no excuse to raise their voices in dispute. Males grow to maturity in subterranean chambers beneath their matriarch's domicile, feeding and amusing themselves while contributing nothing. Often they stay for years beyond the age of maturity, while the matriarch provides them with sustenance. When young trolls are finally pushed from their subchamber, they gather with others of their kind, forming roving gangs of malcontents who complain loudly about all manner of vexation. As much as trolls love to argue, imagine how rare it is for a troll to be driven from his own kind for being too difficult to get along with. Such was Jarakel's fate, a Munger troll from deep in the Hoven. So deluded was he, so bitter and abrasive, that even other trolls found his company intolerable. After one particularly vitriolic outburst in which he claimed the lion's share of loot from their latest raid, his cohorts finally snapped. They turned on him, beat him with clubs, and drove him from the encampment. Enraged at his banishment, he returned the next day, armed with steel, and slew them all, one by one. He then swore a blood oath, he would ever after be a fighting force unto himself. Now he roams the world as the troll warlord, bitter and angry, the imperial high commander of an army of one. Trent Protector. Calls upon the forest to root his foes. Far to the west, in the mountains beyond the Vale of Augury, lie the remains of an ancient power, a fount of eldritch energy nestled deep in the high woods. It is said that the things that grow here, grow strangely. To the forces of nature this is a sacred place, made to stay hidden and unknown. Many are the traps and dangers of this land. There are all-consuming grasses, crossbred fauna, and poisonous flowers, but none are so fierce as the mighty Trent Protectors. These ageless, titanic beings, charged with keeping the peace in this dangerous land, ensure that none within encroach without reason, and none without poach their secrets. For time untold they tended to their holy ground, uninterrupted, only dimly aware of the changing world beyond. Yet inevitably the wider world grew aware of this untamed land, and with each passing winter the outsiders grew bolder. Soon they arrived with tools to cut and with flames to burn, and often the Treants would ponder, who are these fragile, industrious creatures? What now had become of the wild, green world? There came and went an age of questions and of doubts, 1,000 summers of long traditions set to scrutiny, while more and more the outsiders died and fed their earth. When all that bloomed had finally finished their say, curiosity had overcome caution. It was decided, a lone protector would be sent into the wider world, and instructed to wander until the glaciers arose once more, to observe the changing land and its creatures, and to discover what unknown dangers could threaten their sacred ground. Techies surprises enemies with invisible landmines and explosive attacks. In the storied saga of Dredger's Bite, no business has ever been more reviled than Techies' demolitions. Then again, Dredger's Bite no longer exists. Nor does Tot Eren. Or even Trapper Town. In fact, if one were to track the history of Techies' demolitions, they might notice that shortly after Techies appear, towns tend to disappear. Like every inevitable disaster surrounding Techies, the obliteration of Dredger's Bite began with an invention. Tasked with designing a safer way of detonating explosives in the mines beneath the city, pyrotechnic prodigies Squee, Spleen, and Spoon developed their most outlandish creation yet, a button which, when pressed, would trigger a distant device to spark a fuse. Overeager to test their invention, the trio stuffed barrel after barrel with flame salt explosives, piling every corner of their tiny workshop high with the newly developed remote bombs. From this stockpile they plucked a single payload, burying it in a faraway field. As they cowered in a ditch, Spleen pressed the detonator button. Yet after a moment, nothing happened. Confused, he stood up, pressing his button again and again until, finally, an explosion tore a hole in the field. Elated, Squee and Spleen turned toward home just as a massive wave of sound and force arrived to knock them over. Bewildered, their ears ringing from the unexpected blast, they gathered in the dingy miasma to see a smoking ruin where their workshop once stood. Chunks of wood and stone continued to fall as the yawning crater before them slowly deepened into an expanding pit. The whole of Dredger's Bite shuddered, and then gradually started to slide into the mines below as its panicked residents fled. Sitting at the edge of their sinking home, they grinned and giggled, as giddy at the possibilities as they were oblivious to the scorn of their former neighbors. They wondered only one thing: how could they trigger an even bigger blast?